The morning Dexter Bishop rode onto the Kingsley property. The sun was barely cresting the red rock bluffs to the east, and Beatrice Kingsley was already elbow-deep in the irrigation ditch that ran along the south edge of her barley field, trying to figure out why half of it had run dry overnight. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw him. Two horses, one ridden and one trailing behind, moving at a deliberate pace up the rutted wagon road that cut through the lower pasture. Beatrice straightened and pressed the back of her wrist to her forehead to shade her eyes, leaving a streak of wet red mud across her brow. The rider was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat that had seen better days but still carried itself with a kind of authority. His hat was pulled low against the early glare, and he rode the way men rode when they had somewhere to be and were not especially worried about who stood in their path. Beatrice had seen that kind of riding before. It rarely meant anything good. She climbed out of the ditch, pulled her work gloves off one finger at a time, and walked toward the gate that opened onto the road. She was 26 years old. With sun-browned arms and dark hair she kept pinned back under a wide-brimmed felt hat of her own, and she had been running this land alone for 14 months, ever since her father had died of a lung fever that came on fast and left faster, taking him with it. She had learned in those 14 months that the best way to meet trouble was to go out and greet it before it got comfortable on your porch. She reached the gate and leaned one arm on the top rail. The rider slowed when he saw her, which was something. Some men didn't. "Morning," he said, pulling the horse up a few feet short of the gate. He touched the brim of his hat, a courteous gesture that she registered but did not yet trust. "I'm looking for the owner of the Kingsley property, a Mr. Harlan Kingsley." "You're about 14 months too late for that," Beatrice said. "Harlan Kingsley is buried on the rise behind the house. I'm Beatrice Kingsley, his daughter. What do you want?" The man studied her for a moment. She could not make out his eyes well in the shadow of his hat, but she got the sense he was recalibrating something. Organizing a new set of words. "My name is Dexter Bishop," he said. "I work for the Continental Land and Water Company out of Santa Fe. We hold a senior water rights claim on the Caldera Creek watershed, which passes through the northern edge of this property. I've ridden out to discuss the terms of enforcement." Beatrice felt the bottom of her stomach drop away like a trapdoor, but she kept her face perfectly level. She had heard of the Continental Land and Water Company. Everyone in the Rio Morro Valley had heard of them, the way you heard of a bad storm coming 3 counties away. You heard about it, you hoped it turned in another direction, and then sometimes it didn't. "You'd better come in then," she said, and pulled the gate open. She poured him coffee without asking if he wanted it, because she needed something to do with her hands while she thought. The kitchen was small but clean, the table scarred from years of use, the window above the sink looking out over the southern field she had been trying to fix when he arrived. He sat where she told him to sit, which was at the near end of the table, and he set his hat on the bench beside him and ran a hand through dark hair that was damp with dust and sweat from the ride. She finally got a clear look at him. He was somewhere in his early 30s, lean through the jaw, with the kind of weathered look that came from spending most of your waking life outside. He had a straight, serious mouth and dark eyes that were not unkind, which she had not expected and did not know what to do with. She set the coffee in front of him and sat across the table and said, "Say it plain." He wrapped both hands around the tin cup and looked at her directly, which she appreciated even if she was not going to say so. "The Continental Land and Water Company purchased the senior water rights on Caldera Creek from the territorial government 8 years ago," he said. "Your father signed a provisional water use agreement when he homesteaded this land in 1871. That agreement allowed the Kingsley property to draw a specified volume from the creek for irrigation, in exchange for annual fees paid to the company." "I know what the agreement said," Beatrice told him. "I have read every piece of paper my father left behind at least 3 times. Then, you know, the agreement also specified that upon the death of the primary claimant, the provisional rights revert to the company unless a formal succession claim is filed within 1 year of death." Beatrice looked at him steadily. I filed a succession claim. Dexter paused. The company's records show no filed claim. Then the company's records are wrong, she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, which was more frightening than if she had raised it. I rode into Las Cruces myself 11 months ago. I filed the paperwork at the Territorial Land Office. I paid the filing fee. I have the receipt. Something shifted in his expression. He set the cup down slowly. You have a receipt, he repeated. I have a receipt, she confirmed. Would you like to see it? Yes, he said. I very much would. She rose from the table and went to the small desk in the corner of the front room, opened the locked lower drawer with the key she kept on a chain around her neck, and brought back a folded paper that she placed on the table between them. He opened it, read it, and was quiet for a long moment. The receipt was dated October the 9th, 1884, issued by the New Mexico Territorial Land Office, stamped and signed by the deputy clerk. It was exactly what she had said it was. This should have been logged with the company, he said, more to himself than to her. That was the land office's responsibility, Mr. Bishop, not mine. She sat back down and crossed her arms over her chest. Now, what exactly does the Continental Land and Water Company plan to do about the fact that they sent a collection agent to my door based on records that are apparently missing information? He looked up from the paper. She noticed that he did not look embarrassed or defensive. He looked genuinely troubled, which was a different thing. Miss Kingsley, he said, I want to be honest with you. I ride out to properties all over this territory. A good portion of the time, the company's claims are sound and the landowner simply hasn't paid what they owe. But this is not one of those times, and I can see that. You have a valid filed claim. Your water rights are not in default. That is a relief to hear, she said, though I would have preferred not to spend my morning worrying about it. I understand that. He folded the receipt carefully and slid it back across the table to her. I'd like to document this visit and the discrepancy in the company's records. With your permission, I'd also like to take a look at the creek access point. If there's been any interference with your draw, I want to know about it. She watched him for a moment. The kitchen was quiet except for the distant sound of her single farmhand, old Augusto, hammering at something over near the barn. Why would you want to know about it? She asked. You work for the company. I work for the company, he agreed, and the company does a lot of things I find distasteful, but I'm not going to help them take water away from a woman who filed her papers legal and proper and was still put through this because someone lost a document. He picked up his coffee again. That's not a thing I'm willing to do, regardless of who's paying my wages. Beatrice Kingsley had not been surprised by a man in a long time. She was surprised by this one. She refilled his coffee without saying anything, and then she said, The creek access is along the north fence line. I'll show you. They walked out into the rising heat of the morning together, and she noticed that he fell into step slightly behind her, letting her set the direction, which was not how most men behaved on a woman's property. It was a small thing, but she noticed it. The north fence line was a 15-minute walk from the house, through 2 fields of struggling barley, and past a stand of cottonwood that marked the seasonal bed of a smaller drainage. The Caldera Creek itself ran clear and quick where it entered the property, cutting through a rocky channel that her father had shored up with stacked stone years ago. But the irrigation diversion her father had built, the small timber and earth dam that redirected water into the field channels, was not functioning the way it should have been. Dexter crouched down at the edge of the diversion and looked at the timber structure without touching it. Then he stood and walked upstream 30 yards, past the property line, where a pile of rocks and debris had been packed against the upstream bank in a way that was not natural. He stood looking at it with his hands on his hips. Someone has been diverting water away from your intake upstream, he said. Look at this. That's not flood debris. Somebody stacked this here deliberately. Beatrice came and stood beside him and looked at the obstruction. She had walked this stretch of creek 100 times and she had assumed the reduced flow was seasonal. She had not thought to come this far upstream, beyond her own fence line. Who would do that? she said, though even as she said it, she was running through the list of names in her mind. "Who's your closest neighbor to the north?" Dexter asked. "Corwin Slade," she said, and said nothing else, because the name said most of what needed saying for anyone who knew anything about the Rio Morro Valley. Dexter turned to look at her. "How much trouble has Slade given you since your father died?" She thought about how much to tell him. He was still, technically, a representative of a company that had just tried to collect water rights from her on faulty information. But he was also standing on the bank of her creek, having just identified what looked very much like the reason she had spent this whole morning in the mud. "Slade made my father an offer for this land 3 years ago," she said. "My father turned him down. 6 months after my father died, Slade came to see me and made the same offer. I turned him down too. Since then there have been some fences cut, some cattle turned out of their pasture in the night, and now apparently someone has been messing with my water." Looked at the pile of rocks. "I didn't have proof before." Dexter looked at the obstruction for another long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook and a stub of pencil. "I'm going to document this," he said. "Everything I've found this morning. The receipt, the discrepancy in the company's records, and this." He gestured at the upstream obstruction. "I don't know that it'll do you immediate good, but it'll be a record." "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't," he said simply, and began to write. She watched him for a moment, this stranger with his leather notebook and his dark, serious eyes and his apparent refusal to be what she had expected him to be, and felt something complicated beginning to happen in her chest. She pushed it aside firmly. There was too much else to deal with. They worked to clear the obstruction together, which she had not planned on but which happened naturally, because it was heavy work and there were 2 sets of hands available. The sun climbed as they shifted stones and waterlogged debris, and by the time the full flow had returned to her intake, they were both sweated through and covered in creek mud. Beatrice sat back on her heels at the water's edge and watched the channel fill. Dexter sat down on a flat rock and pulled off his coat and rolled up his sleeves, and she noticed almost involuntarily that he had the arms of a man who had done hard physical labor for a long time, not the arms of a paper company man. "You didn't start out writing for a water company," she said. He looked up, slightly surprised. "No," he said. "I grew up on a ranch in the Panhandle. Worked cattle for 12 years. What happened?" He looked out at the water for a moment. "The ranch I worked went under during the drought of '81. Owner couldn't pay. I spent about a year doing whatever work came, and then someone offered me this position. It pays regular, which ranch work often doesn't." He paused. "I'm not always proud of what I'm asked to do, but you do it." "I do," he said, "though days like today make me reconsider." She looked at him. "What happens on the days that aren't like today?" He met her eyes. "I do the job and I go to sleep, and I try not to think about it," he said, with a bluntness that struck her as almost shocking in its honesty. She stood and brushed mud off her trousers, which she wore instead of skirts when she was working, and she thought that this was one of the stranger mornings she had had in a long time, and she had had some genuinely strange ones. "Come back to the house," she said. "Augusto will have started on lunch. It's not much, but it's better than whatever you've got in those saddlebags." He picked up his coat and followed her, and she did not look back to see if he was keeping up, but she heard his footsteps steady behind her. Augusto was a 70-year-old man who had worked for Beatrice's father since before she was born, and who had stayed on after Harlan Kingsley's death at a wage Beatrice could barely sustain, because he claimed he had nowhere else to go, and she privately believed he was telling the truth. He had made a pot of pinto beans with dried chili and the flat cornbread he made most days, and when Beatrice came through the back door with a tall stranger behind her, he looked Dexter up and down with the calm assessment of a man who had seen everything and was no longer startled by any of it. "This is Mr. Bishop," Beatrice said. "He came from the Continental Land and Water Company. He found the problem with the creek intake." Augusto turned back to the stove. "You eating?" he asked Dexter in a tone that was not quite unfriendly. If there's enough, Dexter said. There is, Augusto said, and that was that. They ate at the kitchen table, the three of them, and Beatrice told Augusto about the upstream obstruction and about Corwin Slade, and Augusto listened without interrupting, which was his way, and then said, Slade sent 2 of his men by the south pasture last week. I did not mention it to you because you have enough to worry about. Beatrice looked at him steadily. Augusto, you must tell me these things. I am telling you now, he said unapologetically. Dexter had been quiet during this exchange, eating with the focused attention of a man who had not had a proper meal recently, but now he set his spoon down and said, Miss Kingsley, I want to ask you something directly and I'd like you to give me a direct answer. Go ahead, she said. How close is this property to being in real trouble? Not water rights trouble, all of it. Are you holding on or are you holding on by a thread? The question sat between them. Augusto did not look up from his bowl. Beatrice was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, The latter. Dexter nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. My father left the land clear of debt, she said, because it felt important to say. But running it has cost more than I've brought in, both seasons since he died. The barley's been weak. Part of that is the water interference I didn't know about until today. Part of it is that I don't have enough hands. She looked at her bowl. Slade knows this. He's waiting for me to fold. And then he'll offer me half what the land is worth and smile while he does it. He won't get it, Dexter said, quietly but with a certainty that made her look up. You can't know that, she said. No, he agreed. But I've seen this situation before and I've also seen it go wrong, and I'd rather do something about it while there's still time. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. I'm going to send a report to the company documenting the discrepancy in the records and confirming your rights are valid and current. That takes the water company out of the equation. And I'm going to document the upstream obstruction as potential interference with a valid water use agreement, which gives you legal standing if Slade's name ever comes up. And how exactly does that help me in the immediate term? She asked. It helps you because it means you have one fewer enemy and some paper documentation of what's been happening, he said. It doesn't fix the barley or the fence lines, but it's a start. She looked at him for a long moment. Why are you doing this? He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. Because it's right, he said. And because I've spent the last 2 years doing things that were legal and official and entirely wrong, and I'm tired of it. Augusto rose quietly and refilled Dexter's coffee without being asked. After lunch, Dexter asked if he could ride the property line, and Beatrice said she would come with him. They rode side by side on horses that were, she noticed, of similar temperament, both calm and businesslike. His roan gelding and her sorrel mare moved easily together along the fence lines while he made notes in his leather book and asked her questions about the acreage, the water sources, the history of the fields. He asked good questions, the kind that showed he understood land. At the east fence, where 2 posts had been cut through at the base and left standing only because the wire held them up, Dexter dismounted and crouched to look at the cuts. They were clean, made with a saw not broken by livestock or weather. This is recent, he said. Within the last month, she agreed. I found it 2 weeks ago. I've been propping them with rocks until I can afford new posts. He stood and looked out across the east pasture without speaking for a moment. Then he said, I have some time. She looked at him. What? I was supposed to ride on to the Alvarez property today, he said, but the Alvarez situation is a straightforward fee dispute that can wait a week. I have time. He paused. If you'll allow it, I'd like to help you get those fence posts reset and find out what else needs doing before I write my report. Beatrice Kingsley stared at him. You're a water rights agent. I can also dig a post hole, he said, which I was doing for 12 years before I was a water rights agent. Mr. Bishop, she said, I don't need charity. I know that, he said. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering labor for room and board, which is a fair exchange and not unusual in any state of the territory. He looked at her calmly. You have a legitimate problem with fences and fields and a neighbor who is apparently trying to drive you off your own land. You have one elderly farmhand and not enough hands to address all of it. I have time and I know how to work. That's all I'm suggesting." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing things that she was not quite able to name yet. "The bunkhouse has a spare cot," she said finally. "Breakfast is at first light. You work when I say and you rest when I say, because this is my land and I run it my way." "Understood," he said. "And you keep your report honest," she said. "Whatever you write about this property and these water rights, it's the truth. Nothing adjusted to make the company happy." "That was already my intention," he said. "Good," she said, and turned her horse back toward the house. She did not know what she was doing exactly. She only knew that the water was flowing again in her intake channel, and that there were fence posts to set, and that for the first time in 14 months, there was someone on this land who had skills she needed and appeared to be using them in her direction rather than against her. She was going to hold on to that for the moment and examine the rest of it later. The next morning, she found him already at the east fence at first light, the wagon loaded with new posts he had located in the barn without being told where they were. He had apparently found Augusto's supply of spare timber and done the arithmetic himself. She brought him coffee without saying anything about finding him already there, and he took it and said thank you, and they got to work. He was a good worker, efficient and precise, not showy about it, the kind of man who measured twice and moved once. He did not try to take over from her or redirect her efforts. He worked alongside her the way someone worked who was used to working alongside people rather than above them. By noon they had reset 4 posts and stretched new wire across the gap, and Beatrice's arms ached in a good, productive way. Over the following days, something began to build between them that neither of them addressed directly. He was careful with her space, always asking before he went into a section of the property she had not shown him, always reporting back what he found. She found herself listening for his voice during the day in the way she had not listened for anything in a long time. On the 4th evening, they sat on the porch after supper as the sky turned extraordinary colors over the mesa to the west, deep orange shading into violet, and she said without really planning to, "What do you do when you're not riding for the company?" He looked at the sky. "Read, mostly. I carry books." "What books?" "Whatever I can get, Dickens when I can find it, the papers, some natural philosophy." She turned her head slightly to look at him. He was sitting in the other porch chair, his long legs stretched out, his hat in his lap. "My father had books," she said. "He always said a person who didn't read was only half a person." "Smart man," Dexter said. "He was," she said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. "He also would have liked you. He liked people who did what was right even when it cost them something." Dexter looked at her then, and there was a quality to the look that she was not ready to name yet, but which she was aware of in a way that made her breath come slightly shorter. "I'm sorry you lost him," he said. The words were simple, and she had heard similar words from many people, but from him they landed differently, like he actually meant what he said and had measured the weight of it before he spoke. "Thank you," she said quietly. They sat a while longer in the darkening evening, and it was one of the easiest silences she could remember sitting in. On the 6th day, Corwin Slade arrived. He came with 2 men at his back, and he rode to the house rather than stopping at the gate, which was a deliberate discourtesy, the kind of thing Slade did to make a point about how he regarded your property line. He was a heavy man in his 50s with a square, ruddy face and small pale eyes that had the look of having calculated everything in his life down to the cent. Beatrice came off the porch and stood in the yard before he reached the steps. She heard the barn door behind her and knew without looking that Dexter had come out. "Miss Kingsley," Slade said, not dismounting. "I heard you had a water company man out here. Everything all right?" "Everything is fine," she said. "What do you want, Mr. Slade?" Slade's eyes moved to Dexter, who had walked up and positioned himself about 5 feet to Beatrice's left, his hands loose at his sides. "Who's this?" Slade asked. "Dexter Bishop," Dexter said before Beatrice could answer. Continental Land and Water Company. Slade's eyes narrowed fractionally. Water Company, he repeated. That's right, Dexter said pleasantly. I've been conducting a thorough survey of the Kingsley property water rights situation. Thorough is the key word there. Very complete records I'm compiling, including some recent findings about the Caldera Creek upstream access point. There was a beat of silence. One of Slade's men shifted in his saddle. Upstream access point, Slade said, his voice carefully neutral. Someone had been piling debris and stone against the upstream bank, Dexter said, with the same pleasant conversational tone. Significant enough to reduce the intake volume reaching the Kingsley irrigation diversion. I've documented that in my report. Dated. Described in detail. He looked at Slade with clear, steady eyes. It would be very inconvenient for whoever was responsible if that report were to go to the territorial sheriff alongside the company's records. The air was perfectly still. Somewhere over near the creek, a meadowlark called once and went quiet. Slade looked at Beatrice. I came out here to make you another offer on this property, he said, and the pleasantries were gone from his voice. Fair market value. I know what you consider fair market value, Beatrice said. The answer is no. It was no the first time you asked, and it will be no the last time. This land is going to be more trouble than it's worth to hold onto, Slade said, and it was not quite a threat and was not quite not one. That's my concern, she said. Not yours. Good day, Mr. Slade. He looked at her, then at Dexter, and then he turned his horse and rode back down the track with his men at his heels. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Beatrice released a breath she had been holding for what felt like the entirety of that conversation. That was well done, Dexter said quietly beside her. You helped, she said. You didn't need me to, he said. She looked at him sideways. No, she admitted, but it was better with you here. Neither of them said anything else about it. They went back to work. That evening, Dexter wrote his report at the kitchen table by lamplight, while Beatrice did the accounts at the other end, and Augusto snored softly in the chair by the cold fireplace. The kitchen was warm with the last of the day's heat and the smell of the supper they had finished, and the scratch of Dexter's pen and the quiet scratch of her pencil made a companionable sound in the stillness. She looked up at him once and found him already looking at her, and they both looked back at their papers without speaking, and she felt her heart do something she had not given it permission to do. She thought about that for a long time after she went to bed. The next morning, she came out early, before Augusto, and found Dexter at the corral checking his roan gelding's left forefoot. He had set it down by the time she arrived and was examining something in the dirt. He's been picking up a lot of small stones, he said. The terrain here is harder than what he's used to. He'll be fine. She came to the fence and leaned on it, looking at the horse. You've been moving him every morning and evening, she said. I noticed. Habit, he said. Where do you sleep when you're working, she asked. On the road, he shrugged. Wherever I land, mostly under the stars, a boarding house when there's one within range. That sounds lonely, she said, and she had not intended to say it like that with that particular honesty. He looked at her over the horse's back. It is, he said, simply and without self-pity. She looked at the early light on the mesa, the long shadows drawing back like curtains. I've been thinking, she said, about the barley fields, the ones along the south edge that I've been struggling to irrigate. Now that the creek intake is clear, I should have enough water, but the delivery channels need to be rebuilt from the third junction onward. The timber is rotted through. I know, he said. I looked at it yesterday. She turned her head to look at him. What did you conclude? I concluded you need about 40 feet of new timber framing, possibly more, and that it should be done before the summer gets any drier. He paused. I also concluded that I know how to do it. You've been cataloging problems and solutions ever since you arrived, she said. I suppose I have. Why? He came around the horse and stood at the fence, a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the texture of the stubble along his jaw, the quiet intensity in his eyes. Because this land is worth saving, he said, and because the person trying to save it deserves better than having to do it alone. Her heart was doing the thing again, the unauthorized, inconvenient thing, and she looked away because she did not know what her face was doing. "Dexter," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt him go briefly still at the sound of it. "How long can you actually stay?" He was quiet for a moment. "My next scheduled assignment is 3 weeks out," he said, "but I've been thinking about that." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've been thinking about whether writing for the Continental Land and Water Company is what I want to do with the rest of my working life," he said. "I've been thinking about it since before I rode onto this property, if I'm honest. Coming here has just made me think about it more specifically." She looked at him now directly, because the conversation had taken on a weight that required her full attention. "More specifically how?" she asked. He met her eyes and held them. "You have good land here, Beatrice. You have water now that it's not being interfered with. You have barley that wants to grow if you give it the chance. You have a location that's got 3 market towns within reasonable hauling distance." He paused. "And you have a neighbor who is going to keep making trouble until you have enough hands and enough financial stability that it's not worth his effort to bother you." "All of that is true," she said carefully. "I know land," he said. "I know cattle and crops and water management, and I know how to build things that hold. I've known all of that for a long time, and I've spent the last 2 years writing reports for a company instead of using any of it." He looked at her steadily. "What I'm saying is that I would like to propose something to you, and I need you to hear it as it's intended and not in any other way." "Say it," she said. He took a breath. "I'd like to propose a partnership," he said, "legal and documented. I would invest my savings, which are not inconsiderable for a man who's had few expenses on the road, into the operating costs of this property, in exchange for a formal half-share of the land and its earnings." Beatrice stared at him. "That's not a small thing you're suggesting," she said. "No," he agreed, "it's not. We've known each other less than 2 weeks. Yes, and you're offering me money and labor for half of everything. Half of everything I would work toward building," he said. "With you, not in place of you." She turned away from him and walked 3 steps and stood looking out over the fields, which were green and gold in the morning light, imperfect and struggling, and hers. Hers because her father had built them from nothing and she had held on to them through the hardest year of her life. She thought about what it would mean. Another pair of hands, skilled hands, capital she did not have. Someone who understood the land the way she understood it, who had already proved in less than 2 weeks that he saw the same things she saw when he looked at it. She also thought about the way her heart behaved when he was standing close to her, and the way the evenings on the porch had felt like something she had been missing for years without knowing it, and the fact that he had looked at the receipt for her water rights with genuine relief on her behalf rather than calculation. She turned back around. "I would want it in writing," she said. "Proper legal documents, a lawyer if I can get one to come out from Las Cruces." "That's exactly how it should be done," he said. "And the partnership is for the land and the business," she said. "Nothing else is part of this agreement." He looked at her and there was something warm and careful in his expression. "Nothing else is in the agreement," he confirmed. "What else happens or doesn't happen is entirely separate from the paperwork." She felt herself almost smile and pressed her lips together before it fully formed. "All right, Mr. Bishop," she said. "We'll draw up the papers." It took 8 days to get the lawyer out from Las Cruces, a small, meticulous man named Mr. Caldecott, who wore round spectacles and asked precise questions, and seemed genuinely unbothered by the somewhat unusual nature of the arrangement he was being asked to document. He spent 2 days at the property, examining the land records and the water rights documentation and Dexter's financial statement, and then he drew up a partnership agreement that was thorough and unambiguous and gave both parties equal standing. They signed it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning in late July of 1885, with Augusto and Mr. Caldecott as witnesses, and when it was done, Beatrice felt something settle in her chest that had been off balance for a very long time. Dexter sent his resignation to the Continental Land and Water Company by letter that same afternoon. What followed was the hardest and most productive summer of Beatrice's life. They rebuilt the irrigation channels from the third junction to the south field edge, timber by timber, working in the early mornings before the heat peaked. They replaced the rotted posts along the east and north fence lines. They turned under the failed sections of barley and replanted with seed Dexter, identified at the feed merchant in town, as better suited to the soil composition of the south field. They bought 4 additional cattle with part of Dexter's investment and expanded the small herd Beatrice had been maintaining at half capacity. Augusto, who had been quietly skeptical of the entire arrangement in the way of a man who had seen many arrangements fail, gradually, and without announcing, it began to treat Dexter as a member of the household rather than a temporary presence. He started making more food. He began telling Dexter, unprompted, the history of specific features of the land, the places where flood had cut new channels, the rock formations that were good landmarks, the location of the second spring that Harlan Kingsley had never fully developed. These were the things he told you when he had decided you were staying. Through all of it, Beatrice and Dexter moved around each other with a careful awareness that was getting harder to maintain. She caught herself watching him work sometimes, the way he moved with confidence and economy, never wasted motion, and she would realize she had been watching longer than any practical purpose required. He caught her watching once, and neither of them said anything about it, but he did something with the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, and made her feel as if the temperature had gone up by several degrees. One evening in early August, they had ridden out to check the north pasture and got delayed by a section of fence that needed mending, and by the time they turned back toward the house the sky was full of stars and the moon was rising over the red bluffs and painting everything silver. They rode slowly because there was no hurry now and the horses were content to walk. "Can I ask you something?" Dexter said. "You generally do," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see his profile against the moonlit sky, the strong line of his jaw, the way he held himself in the saddle. 12 years on a cattle ranch. It showed. "What were you going to do," he said, "before I came?" If things had kept going the way they were going, she considered the question seriously. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Keep going, I suppose, until I couldn't. And then, I don't know that either." She looked at the dark shapes of the mesa against the stars. "I suppose I would have sold eventually, not to Slade, someone, and gone somewhere." She paused. "I didn't have a picture of it, of where I would have gone." "You didn't want to leave," he said. "It was not a question." "This land is my father's life's work," she said. "It's the only thing I have left of him. No, I didn't want to leave." "You won't have to," he said quietly. She looked at him. In the moonlight his face was open in a way it rarely was in full daylight. All the usual careful containment softened. "Dexter," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it's too soon, and I know we've both been very proper about keeping the partnership and the rest of it something else. But I want you to know that the way I feel about this land and about staying here and about the work we've been doing is not separable from the way I feel about you." He looked at her directly. "It never has been." She held his gaze for a long moment. The horses walked on beneath them, indifferent and slow. "I know," she said. "I've known that for a while." "And," he said. There was nothing casual about how he asked it. She pulled her mare to a stop. He stopped the roan beside her. They were very close, the horses almost touching, and she could see his eyes clearly even in the moonlight, waiting and careful and more vulnerable than she had expected. "I think you are the most unexpectedly good man I have ever met," she said. "And I think I have been trying very hard not to be in love with you because it felt too fast and too strange and I didn't know what to do with it. And now," he said very quietly, "and now I'm tired of trying not to be," she said. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, the one that was resting on the saddle horn, and held it in both of his. His hands were warm and rough and steady. "I should have said it sooner," he said. "You said it at the right time," she told him. They sat there in the moonlight for a while, hands linked across the space between their horses, and it was one of the most complete moments Beatrice could remember, full to the edges with something she did not have words for and did not need words for. Eventually, the horses began to drift toward home of their own accord, and they let them, still holding hands until the distance between the animals made it impractical, and then they rode side by side the rest of the way home in a silence that was entirely different from any silence that had come before it. The last of the summer passed and the fall came on, and with it the barley harvest, which was the best the property had produced in 4 years according to the records Beatrice's father had kept, and which Beatrice had continued in his careful, neat columns. They hauled 3 wagon loads to the market town of Mesa Verde, 20 miles southwest, and came back with enough money to carry them into winter with room to spare. Corwin Slade did not come back to the property. Whether that was because of Dexter's presence, or because the report Dexter had filed with the company and with the territorial sheriff's office had made it impractical, or because he had simply moved his attentions elsewhere, Beatrice did not know for certain and found she did not particularly need to. The fences held, the water ran, the cattle fattened through the fall on good grass. In October, on an evening when the cottonwoods along the creek were the color of new gold coins and the air had turned crisp and carried the smell of coming change, Dexter came to find her in the barn where she was doing the evening feed, and he was carrying something in his hand that she could not immediately identify. It was a small piece of turquoise, set in a silver band, rough-made but unmistakably intentional. He held it out to her and said, "I had this made in town. The silversmith is not what you'd call a fine jeweler, but the stone is good, and I thought the color suited you." She looked at it and then at him. He was still holding it out, patient and slightly tense in the way of someone who has committed to a thing and is waiting to find out if it was the right thing. "Is this a proposal, Dexter Bishop?" she said. "It is," he said. She took the ring from his hand and looked at the turquoise, which was the exact color of the sky over the mesa on a clear morning, which was her favorite kind of sky. The silver was not perfectly even, but it was strong, which seemed right. "Ask me properly," she said. He took a breath, and the tension went out of it, replaced by something softer. "Beatrice," he said, "I came to this property to collect water rights, and I found something I had not expected to find, and I have been grateful for it every day since. I would like to spend the rest of my life being grateful if you'll allow me to." He looked at her steadily. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without hesitating, because she had been certain of it for months, and the only question had been timing. He put the ring on her finger, and it fit, which he had guessed at by indirect means, and when it was on she held her hand up and looked at it for a moment. "It's the right color," she said. "I thought so," he said. Then she stepped forward and he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his chest and listened to his heart beating, steady and sure, and the horses in the stalls beside them shifted and blew soft breaths in the warm barn smell of hay and horses, and outside the cottonwoods held their gold against the evening. They were married in December of 1885, in the church in the town of Mesa Verde, with Augusto as a witness, and the minister's wife and 2 families from neighboring properties who had become friendly with Beatrice over the years in attendance. It was a quiet ceremony in a small stone church, and Beatrice wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool cloth that she had bought with a portion of the barley money, and Dexter wore his best coat and had his boots cleaned to a shine that Augusto had suggested he achieve, and then helped him achieve. When the minister asked if anyone present had objection, there was the kind of silence that actually means no one objects at all, just a church full of people holding their breath because it's a beautiful moment and they don't want to interrupt it. And then Dexter and Beatrice made their promises to each other in clear voices, looking at each other the whole time. And when the minister said they were married, Dexter took her face in his hands and kissed her, and someone in the back row said something that made several people laugh, and it was the best day. They had supper at the one restaurant in Mesa Verde, the 6 of them, Beatrice and Dexter, Augusto, and the 3 neighbors, and it was noisy and warm and full of talk and laughter, and Beatrice sat next to her husband, which was a word she was going to need some time to get used to, and felt a peace and a happiness that she had almost convinced herself she would not get to have. Augusto, by the end of the evening, had told enough stories about Harlan Kingsley that Beatrice laughed until she cried, which was the best possible way to feel about someone you missed. The first winter as partners and as husband and wife was genuinely hard in the practical sense, because winter on the high desert mesa was not easy, and there was always more work than hands and more cold than you expected. But it was also the best winter Beatrice could remember, because there was someone else on the other side of every difficulty, someone who knew the land and the work, and who did not expect her to carry everything alone. They fell into a rhythm together that felt like something built carefully over years, though it had only been months, and she thought sometimes that this was the nature of the right person. They fit the space they occupy so completely that you forget the space was ever empty. They talked every evening. That was the thing she had not expected to prize so highly, and which she found she prized above almost everything else. They talked about the land and the cattle and the plans for the spring, and they talked about books, because Dexter did have books, 3 of them battered and annotated in margins, which she read and returned to him with her own observations, and they talked about the things they had each done before they found their way to this property and this life. She told him about growing up on this land with her father, the things Harlan Kingsley had taught her about water and soil and patience, and he told her about the panhandle and the long cattle drives and the particular quality of silence on the plains at night. He wrote a letter to the territorial sheriff in late January, following up on the documented interference with the creek intake. The sheriff's office sent a deputy to speak with Corwin Slade. What exactly was said in that conversation, Beatrice never learned in detail. What she knew was that there was no further interference with the creek, no fences cut, no cattle turned out in the night. Slade apparently concluded that the Kingsley property was no longer a worthwhile target, which was the only conclusion Beatrice needed him to reach. In February, she told Dexter that she thought come fall there would be 3 of them. They were at the kitchen table, early morning before the day's work began, and she said it quietly and directly, because she had learned that he liked directness, and because there was no other way she wanted to say something like this. He sat perfectly still for a moment, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and then he set it down very carefully and looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before, which she could only describe as undone in the best possible way. "Beatrice," he said, and her name in his voice in that particular tone was a whole sentence. "Yes," she said simply. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it for a long moment without speaking, and she could see him doing the thing he did when something moved him deeply, going very still and inward, feeling it completely before he said anything about it. "Are you all right?" he said at last. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling fine," she said. "Strong, actually. Don't make a fuss." "I won't make a fuss," he said, and then immediately started planning things she needed and making lists in his head that she could see forming behind his eyes. She laughed at him, which made him look at her with a warm, helpless kind of expression that she thought she could spend the rest of her life looking at. Spring came and the fields went in, and the cattle calved. 4 new calves that were all healthy, and which Dexter checked every morning with the focused attention of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. He hired a second hand in April, a young man from a family in Mesa Verde named Tomás who was 18, just turned, and worked hard and learned quickly and was good with the animals. With Tomás and Augusto and Dexter and Beatrice herself working through the long spring days, the property finally had enough hands, and the difference was visible in everything: the fields, the fences, the general sense of a land that was being cared for at the right pace. Beatrice worked through the pregnancy with the matter-of-fact determination that characterized everything she did, adjusting what she needed to adjust and refusing to adjust anything else. Until Dexter very diplomatically suggested in late July that perhaps the heavier irrigation work could be delegated to him for a while, and she considered this suggestion for a full day before agreeing. The baby came in October, just as the barley was coming in for the second time. It was a boy. They named him Harlan Dexter Kingsley Bishop, which was a great deal of name for someone who weighed approximately 7 pounds and had very strong opinions about being put down, but which seemed entirely appropriate to Beatrice, who wanted her father's name to keep going in the world, and to Dexter, who looked at the name written in the family Bible with an expression of quiet pride that she had not seen on him before and which suited him very well. Augusto held the baby with the careful, wondering attention of someone who had not expected to be given this and found it unexpectedly important, and said, in a voice rougher than usual, "He has Harlan's forehead." "He does," Beatrice agreed. "He will be trouble," Augusto said, which was the highest compliment he could think of. Little Harlan was, indeed, an extremely determined small person from the very beginning, with a loud voice and a clear sense of what he wanted, which turned out to be exactly his parents' full attention at all times. He slept in a cradle that Dexter built during the long evenings of late summer from good cedar wood, following a design he found in a book he borrowed from the minister's wife, and which he built carefully and without hurry, the way he built everything. Watching him build that cradle, in the lamplight of the front room with his sleeves rolled up and the wood shavings collecting on the floor around him, Beatrice thought that she had perhaps underestimated, in all the practicalities of the past year, how much it would mean to have a man beside her who made things, who built things to last. Her father had been that kind of man. She had missed it more than she had let herself know. That second winter was different from the first in all the ways a winter with a baby is different, which is to say it was noisier and more exhausting and more joyful in ways that were hard to explain. Little Harlan thrived. He grew fast and loudly, and with great enthusiasm for eating and for looking at everything, and Beatrice found that the exhaustion and the joy existed simultaneously and reinforced each other, which she had not expected. Dexter proved himself entirely committed as a father in a way that went beyond what she had hoped for and landed solidly in what she had not dared to plan on. He got up in the night. He learned what each particular variety of the baby's complaints meant. He carried Harlan around the kitchen in the early mornings while Beatrice slept an extra hour, singing off-key and completely unself-consciously, which she discovered by waking early one morning and lying still in bed listening and laughing quietly into the pillow. "I heard you," he said when she came to the kitchen doorway. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "You were laughing at my singing," he said. "I was not," she said. "I was enjoying it very much." He looked at her with dry amusement. The baby looked up at her from the curve of his father's arm with enormous dark eyes that were going to be exactly like Dexter's. That spring, the property ran its first actual profit. Not a large one, but a genuine one, with money that could be put back into improvements rather than simply used to survive. They used part of it to put up a proper storage barn that would hold the barley harvest without risk of weather damage. They used another part to improve the second spring that Augusto had shown them in the high pasture, developing it into a reliable water source that meant the north pasture could support more cattle year-round. Dexter sent a careful, courteous letter to the Continental Land and Water Company, settling the last of the original water rights paperwork, and formally closing out any outstanding company interest in the Kingsley property. He received back a letter from the company's legal office acknowledging the closure and buried at the end a terse acknowledgement that the record discrepancy had been identified as a clerical error. He showed Beatrice the letter and she read it twice and handed it back to him. "Would you like to respond?" he asked. "No," she said. "We're done with them." "We are," he agreed, and they were. Little Harlan learned to walk in the summer, at exactly 10 months old, which he accomplished with tremendous seriousness and very little assistance, pulling himself up on the kitchen table, and then simply letting go and walking across to Dexter, who was kneeling on the floor a few feet away with his arms out and an expression of pure delighted shock. Beatrice had been watching from the doorway and saw the whole thing, and she pressed her hand to her mouth because the feeling was too large for a sound. Augusto, who claimed to have seen the whole thing from the window, spent the rest of the day in a state of suppressed joy that manifested as being even more thorough and precise than usual about everything he did. By the time Harlan was 2 and beginning to produce opinions on a wide range of subjects in a language that was approximately half recognizable words and half his own invention, Beatrice found herself thinking about what came next. Not because she was not satisfied, but because she was the kind of person who always had the next year in mind alongside the present one. She and Dexter had a long conversation one evening on the porch, after Harlan was asleep, about what they wanted the property to look like in 5 years. He wanted to expand the cattle operation. She wanted to try a section of apple trees along the south slope, where the soil was different and she thought the drainage was right. They discussed it with the same focused pleasure they brought to everything they planned together, disagreeing on some points and finding their way to agreement by the particular route they had developed, which involved both of them saying what they actually thought rather than managing each other, which took longer but produced better results. They decided to do both, the cattle and the apple trees. It would be tight for a season, maybe 2, but they had proved to themselves that they could hold on to things through tight seasons. Later that evening, when the stars were out and the mesa was a dark shape against the sky, Dexter said, "I want you to know something." "What?" she said. "When I rode onto this property the first time, I had a job to do and I was going to do it," he said. "I wasn't looking for anything else. I wasn't expecting anything." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "What I found," he said, "is the best thing I've ever had. The land, the work, the life." He turned his head to look at her. You are the best thing I have ever had." Beatrice Kingsley Bishop, who was not a woman given to easy sentiment, felt the back of her throat tighten with something warm and true. "You came to collect water rights," she said. "I did," he agreed. "And instead you offered me half of everything else," she said. He looked at her steadily. "What I had was not much," he said, "but yes, what I had I offered. And I took it," she said. "You did," he said. "And you should know that I have been grateful for that every single day since." She took his hand on the porch rail, the same way she had reached for his hand on that first night on horseback under the moon, and held it, and they sat together in the quiet of their land and their life, and the particular deep contentment of people who have built something real together. The following spring, Beatrice told him there would be a 4th of them in the autumn. He received this news with the same initially stunned stillness he had received the first news, and then he laughed, an actual genuine laugh that she heard rarely enough that it always delighted her when it came, and he pulled her to him right there in the south field between the rows of young barley, and held her, and said something into her hair that she could not quite catch, but which sounded like everything he meant and more. The second child was a girl, born in November, small and dark-haired and formidably loud from the first moment, with an opinion about everything immediately. They named her Clara Mee Bishop, Mee for a grandmother of Dexter's who he had spoken of once as the toughest woman he had ever known before he met Beatrice, which Beatrice took as the compliment it was intended to be. Harlan, who was almost 3, regarded his sister with an initial suspicion that gave way over the course of about 2 weeks to a proprietary protectiveness that made both his parents quietly laugh behind his back. He brought her things, small things he considered important, a smooth pebble, a dried leaf, his second favorite wooden horse, and laid them near her with the solemnity of a child engaged in serious diplomacy. Augusto, who was by now 73 and more or less, officially retired from heavy labor but entirely unwilling to stop working entirely, became her most devoted admirer from the first moment he saw her, and spent a great deal of his days seated near wherever she happened to be, which was enormously convenient for Beatrice in practical terms. The apple trees went in the following spring, 50 young trees along the south slope in careful rows, planted with Dexter's characteristic precision, and watered through a new channel they had run from the main creek irrigation system. They would not produce for several years. That was the nature of apple trees, and the nature of long investments, and the nature of people who intend to stay somewhere for a very long time. Tomás, who had been with them now for 3 years and had grown from a boy into a young man of real competence, took on the management of the cattle with enough authority that Dexter could step back from the day-to-day of it, which gave him time to spend on the development of the water system and on the construction work that the property always seemed to need. The summer that Clara was 2 and Harlan was almost 5 and could ride a small pony around the yard under Augusto's extremely watchful supervision, Corwin Slade's property went into foreclosure. Beatrice heard about it from the wife of the grain merchant in Mesa Verde, who heard about everything. Slade had overextended himself buying up land to the north, and the bank had called in his notes. He was gone from the valley by the following autumn. Beatrice heard this news and felt nothing in particular, which she considered the appropriate response. She had not spent much time thinking about Slade in years. He had mattered once as a threat, and then he had not mattered, and now he was gone and the land went on. On an evening in that same summer, when the light was long and golden, and the barley fields were full and rustling, and the cattle were moving slowly across the upper pasture in the evening way of cattle, and Harlan was asleep inside with Clara asleep beside him on the big bed, and Augusto was at the small table on the porch playing patience with a worn deck of cards, Beatrice and Dexter walked together along the north fence line the way they still walked sometimes in the evenings, just the two of them. The creek ran clear in its channel, the sound of it steady and reliable, the sound of water that had been there before them and would be there after, water that fed the fields and the cattle and the apple trees that were putting on their second season of growth. The cottonwoods were tall and full. The evening star was up. "Do you ever regret it?" Beatrice asked, not anxiously, just honestly. He looked at her, surprised. "Regret what?" "Giving up the road," she said. "The company work, the travel." "You saw a lot of country." He walked a few steps and considered this with the seriousness he gave to honest questions. "I saw a lot of country," he agreed. "I saw it from the back of a horse alone on someone else's business. That is a particular way to see country, and it has a particular kind of loneliness to it that you don't notice until you stop doing it." He paused. "No, I don't regret it, not for a single morning since I stayed." She nodded slowly. "Do you?" he asked. "Regret letting me stay?" She stopped walking and turned to face him, and the evening light was on him, and the creek was running behind him, and he was looking at her with that particular quality of attention that she thought she would never stop finding remarkable, the way he looked at her as though she were worth looking at with his full self. "You came to collect water rights," she said for the second time, and it had become something between them, a kind of private landmark. "I did," he said for the second time. "And you ended up offering me half of everything else instead," she said. "I did," he said. She stepped forward and put her hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady beat of him. "Dexter," she said, "you did not give me half. You brought yourself and you became part of everything. That is not the same as giving half." She looked up at him. "This land is yours as much as mine. Those children are yours and mine. This life is ours." He covered her hand with his and looked at her with something that was too large for any expression to fully hold. "Yes," he said. "It is." They stood there by the creek in the long evening light, her hand on his chest and his hand over hers, and the water ran and the cottonwoods moved in the evening breeze, and somewhere up at the house, Augusto's chair creaked on the porch boards, and the sound of the cards being shuffled carried soft on the warm air. The Kingsley property went on. The Bishop Partnership, written in careful legal language by a meticulous lawyer from Las Cruces, and in something considerably less formal but considerably more permanent by two people who had found each other at the intersection of a water rights dispute and a dry creek intake, held through every season that came after. The barley harvests improved each year. The cattle herd grew. The apple trees in their 5th year produced a modest first crop that Harlan, who was now 7 and deeply invested in the outcome, inspected every morning for weeks before they were ready. Clara, who was 4 and had no patience for gradual processes of any kind, ate 3 of them straight off the tree before they were properly ripe and was unrepentant about it. Augusto, who had been saying he was too old for this since before Beatrice could remember, went on being not too old for a good while yet. He sat on the porch in the mornings and evening and played his cards and told stories to the children that were equal parts Harlan Kingsley's actual history and Augusto's considerable invention, and neither Beatrice nor Dexter corrected any of it, because the stories were always in the right spirit even when the facts were approximate. The day came that Beatrice and Dexter filed an additional land claim on the 30 acres adjacent to their north boundary, which had been Slade's land and which had been sitting idle since the foreclosure. The paperwork went through the Territorial Land Office without incident. There was a different clerk now, a competent young woman named Miss Flores who filed things correctly and did not lose receipts. When the claim was confirmed, Dexter walked out to stand on the north boundary and look at the new acreage, which was rough but had good water access from the creek's upper reach and which would be, he said, excellent cattle ground once the brush was cleared. Beatrice came and stood beside him and looked at it with him. "Your father would have wanted this," he said, "this exact piece of land. He tried to claim it before Slade got it," she said. "He always said the north water access made it worth whatever it took." Dexter nodded slowly. "He was right. He usually was," she said. They stood there for a while, the two of them, looking at what had been added to what they had, which was already more than either of them had started out expecting to have. She thought about the morning he had ridden up the wagon road, one man with one trailing horse, and a leather notebook full of the company's records, and a job to do that she had been dreading. She thought about the coffee she had poured without asking, and the walk to the creek, and the upstream obstruction that he had noticed without her having to ask him to look, and the careful way he had opened her receipt and read it and believed her. She thought about the first time she had heard him sing to the baby in the early morning kitchen, off-key and entirely serious about it. She thought about the ring on her finger, rough silver and turquoise the color of the morning sky, made by a silversmith who was not a fine jeweler but who had made something that lasted. She thought about 14 months of holding everything alone and the particular exhaustion of it, the kind that was not about physical labor but about the weight of being the only person on the whole property who was responsible for all of it. And she thought about the moment she had stopped being the only one. "I'm glad you rode up that road," she said. He turned his head to look at her, and he was smiling, the full smile that she did not see often enough and never tired of seeing. "So am I," he said. "Though I will tell you honestly that when you came to that gate with mud on your face and looked at me like you were perfectly prepared to fight me if you needed to, I had approximately no idea how my life was about to change," she laughed. "You were very dignified about it." "I was terrified," he said. "You have a very direct way of standing." "I get that from my father," she said. "I know," he said. "I can see it in Harlan already." She looked back at the new land, the rough brush and the good water. "He's going to love this piece," she said. "He already thinks the whole north pasture belongs to him." "He's 7, Dexter said. "He thinks everything belongs to him." "He'll learn," she said. "He will," he agreed. "We'll teach him." That word "we" had never grown ordinary to her. She thought it never would. It was still the best word in any sentence, that small, complete, sufficient word. They walked back together across their land in the afternoon light, the red bluffs to the east and the mesa to the west and the long fields between them, the creek running in its channel, the apple trees standing in their rows on the south slope, and the house ahead of them with its porch where Augusto would be sitting and the sound of children coming from inside it, and all of it theirs, built from a dry creek intake, and a receipt filed in time, and a man who had offered what he had without condition. The evening gathered around them warm and golden and certain, and the land held them the way good land holds people who have decided to stay, which is to say completely and without reservation. And everything that had needed to be built was built, and everything that had needed to be mended was mended, and everything that had needed to be found had been found, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.